Bradley, let's take a look at your images. Sorry. There we go. I noticed that you were using the iPhone, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well it did with changing the depth of field in these different ways. So let's look at aperture here. F1.8. Is that right? It says f1.8 for each. However, I am assuming that you went into the editing menu with the image and changed the aperture there. So a huge difference in the depth of field. Yeah, really beautiful. Great job. Interesting that even in the metadata, it doesn't show that change. But there you have it. Okay. So distance from subject. I like that you came in really close. I think that works well in terms of showing the change in the depth of field. So very nice. And the composition for both actually works very nicely. I like the shadow at the bottom coming in almost like an arrow leading into the frame, and then the contrail from the plane also pulling the eye into the frame. So very nicely done. And the focal length of the lens here, 26 millimeters and 41. So in this case, there isn't as much of a change in the depth of field visible. It's not that it doesn't occur, certainly. If we come in closer, you can see a little bit, but not nearly the difference as we saw in the other two sets. But lovely job on these, and you've composed the images really very nicely. So, all right, I enjoyed seeing them. Thank you. Let's take a look at your images. So here we have your aperture set, this one at f36 and the second at f5.6, and there's certainly a change in the depth of field. And I think that the shallower depth of field image works somewhat better, as it does subtly isolate the model train from the background. Okay, I would like you to have used a different subject or setting for each category. That said, you did a nice job on them. So let's look at distance. At f9, greater depth of field, and coming in close. I don't know what the difference was, maybe, what, 3 feet perhaps? But the depth of field is definitely much shallower here when you're closer in. Okay. And finally, focal length of lens, 18 millimeters and 70 millimeters. Yeah, so definitely a change in the depth of field with the shallower depth of field with the longer lens, with the telephoto lens, and shallower depth of field, greater depth of field here with the shorter lens. Okay, again, I would like to have seen different settings, but you've done a good job in showing the changes in the depth of field. All right, thank you, Shane. Matona. So let's take a look at your images. This set for aperture, and actually, you did change the aperture a little bit, but what you really changed was and the focal length a little bit, but what you really changed was your point of focus. That is where what area you focused on. And so in this frame, you focused on the bulb closest to the camera, and in this frame you focused on the beam back here, so further back in the frame. And the assignment is to keep the same subject in focus and change the other things, the aperture, the focal length of the lens, the distance from subject. So if you want to redo this, that's great. Use the extremes of the aperture, so the largest aperture your lens is capable of, and then the smallest. Okay, let's look at distance. And the distance images worked well. It's a little difficult to see the change in the depth of field because the area back here is a little dark, but you've certainly achieved shallow depth of field by coming in closer here. And in this image, it's hard to see any, again, as well, but the depth of field is definitely greater here. The foliage in the shadows here is much more in focus. Okay. And then focal length of lens, you definitely changed the focal length of the lens, but it's actually almost impossible to see the change in the depth of field in this setting, because your background, the sky, is at infinity, and the electrical pole is not that close, and so when you have all of the frame at a distance that's more than 20 feet, you're not going to see that much of a change in depth of field. And because there's nothing between the power pole and the lines and the background, it's hard to see that a change as well. In addition, the aperture is pretty small. It's not tiny, but it will give you relatively great depth of field. And of course, being further away gives you great depth of field as well. So you might try a situation where you have space in the frame, but you also have elements going back in the frame, like a series of people or chairs or something of that sort. Okay, so if you want to redo, I'd be delighted to look at the new images. Okay, thanks. Alex, is it Llorin or Llorin? Let's look at your aperture images. I see that you are using an iPhone, so I assume, though perhaps I shouldn't, but I assume that you went into the editing menu afterwards and changed the size of the aperture here. So I can't tell what the aperture, the changed aperture is, because both images show as if they're at 1.8. So we'll assume this one is at 1.8, so nice shallow depth of field. And this one maybe at f22 or whatever the minimum aperture is that the iPhones have. Okay, good job on those. And then distance. Both are beautiful images. I'm sure they were not taken in France, but they almost have that feel. I think it's the lavender that perhaps is making me think of that. But both images work very nicely, and obviously this image where you've come in closer has shallower depth of field than this one where you're further back in the frame. Okay, and then focal length of lens. So this is a wide angle further back, and then coming in closer with the lens, so at 53 millimeters, which is a normal lens. And the depth of field it's not especially, it's just mildly shallow. I guess. And then in this one, where the focal length is much shorter, the background is certainly sharper. It's not tack sharp, but it's definitely sharper. So good job on all of these, actually, and I am pleasantly surprised. I don't know why. I I have great faith in Apple, but a bit surprised at how well the iPhone does with showing changes in depth of field. And not just by changing the aperture, but by changing the distance and the focal length of the lens. Okay, so great job, Alex. Thank you.